They called Shadow a killer, but the old Mustang had spent his whole life guarding something far more dangerous than himself. The wind rolled low across Black Hollow Ranch, carrying red dust over weathered fences and dry Montana grass that bent like tired men under the weight of October. Caleb Whitmore stood at the edge of the north pasture, his boots planted deep in cracked earth, his jaw tight beneath the shadow of his father's old hat. Before him, the black Mustang circled the far fence line like a storm that refused to rest. Shadow's powerful frame cut through the fading light, his dark coat gleaming like polished obsidian beneath streaks of amber sunset. Every ranch hand in Bitterroot County knew the stories. They said the horse had nearly trampled buyers. They said no man alive could break him. They said after Richard Whitmore died, the beast had become too dangerous to keep. But Caleb knew fear looked different when it wore familiar eyes. Shadow did not rage without reason. He watched. He waited. And every single time Harold Pierce's silver Cadillac rolled up the gravel drive, the Mustang became something fierce enough to shake grown men. His unstable, Caleb, Harold said that afternoon, stepping from his car in polished boots too clean for ranch dirt. His pressed grey suit looked foreign against the old barn, like a vulture dressed for church. Your father trusted me to protect this estate, and I'm telling you now, that horse is a liability. Caleb said nothing at first. He kept his eyes on Shadow, who stood rigid near the paddock, ears pinned, nostrils wide, every muscle drawn tight the moment Harold approached. Dust swirled around the horse's hooves as he slammed one iron foot against the ground. A warning. Harold adjusted his leather briefcase and forced a thin smile. The insurance alone could bury you. Sell him. Or have him put down before someone gets hurt. The words hung in the autumn air like poison. Caleb's fingers curled slowly at his sides. Since his father's funeral 3 weeks earlier, Harold had arrived almost daily with paperwork, contracts, and gentle threats wrapped in legal advice. Sell parcels. Transfer assets. Sign early. Save the ranch. But something about the man's urgency felt wrong. Richard Whitmore had built Black Hollow with his bare hands, surviving droughts, cattle disease, and Wyoming winters that split wood like gunfire. Caleb could still hear his father's voice. Never trust a man who smiles while asking for your land. Suddenly Shadow lunged against the fence with a force that rattled old timber. Harold stumbled backward, his face draining pale. That animal is insane, he barked. But Caleb didn't move. Because in that violent burst, he saw something others refused to see. Shadow wasn't attacking. He was warning. Protecting. The Mustang's dark eyes locked not with madness, but with memory. As if somewhere beneath grief, dust, and silence, Richard Whitmore had left his son one final guardian. Caleb rested his hand on the rough fence post, his voice low as the dying sun. No, he said, watching Harold carefully. I think he knows something. And for the first time since his father was buried beneath the cottonwoods on the southern ridge, Caleb began to wonder if the most dangerous thing on Black Hollow Ranch had never been the horse at all. The house Caleb Whitmore had inherited was too large for one man and too quiet for a grieving son. Each floorboard inside Black Hollow Ranch seemed to remember his father's boots better than his own, groaning softly beneath the weight of memory as cold November rain tapped against the windows. Richard Whitmore had been gone 23 days, yet his presence still lingered in every corner of the sprawling ranch house, from the faded cattle brands hanging over the stone fireplace to the half-finished ledger resting on his office desk. Caleb stood alone in that office now, staring at shelves lined with decades of ranch records, tax filings, land surveys, and weather journals written in his father's careful hand. Outside, thunder rolled low over the Bitterroot Mountains, but inside, the storm felt older. More personal. Harold Pierce sat across from him, neat as ever, his silver hair combed perfectly, his voice smooth enough to pass for concern. Your father left behind substantial debt, Harold said, sliding another stack of documents across the desk. Taxes, livestock maintenance, legal obligations. Selling the North Ridge acreage would stabilize everything. Caleb glanced down but did not reach for the papers. Richard Whitmore had always been many things. Stubborn. Proud. Hard as frozen fence wire. But reckless with money was never one of them. He never mentioned debt, Caleb said quietly. Harold folded his manicured hands. Your father was protecting you. The answer came too easily. Like it had been polished before delivery. Caleb leaned back slowly, his chair creaking beneath him, and looked toward the rain-streaked pasture where Shadow stood beneath the skeletal branches of an old cottonwood. Even from this distance, the black mustang seemed less like livestock and more like a silent witness. Since Richard's death, Shadow had become increasingly restless, especially near the old south barn and anywhere Harold walked. Caleb remembered being 10 years old when his father first brought Shadow home, a wild Nevada mustang no rancher could break. Richard never tried. Some spirits are not meant to be broken, he had told his son. Only understood. Over the years, Shadow had carried Richard through blizzards, droughts, and cattle drives stretching 50 miles across unforgiving country. The horse had never once turned dangerous. Until now. Or perhaps not dangerous. Protective. Caleb's gaze shifted to a locked drawer in his father's desk. He had noticed it before, but today something felt different. Perhaps it was Harold's relentless pressure. Perhaps it was Shadow's warning. Or perhaps grief had finally sharpened into instinct. I need time, Caleb said firmly. Harold's jaw tightened almost invisibly, though his smile remained. Time can be expensive. Caleb stood. Then I will pay for it. The lawyer gathered his papers with measured precision, but as he stepped onto the porch, Shadow let out a thunderous cry from the pasture below, a sound so fierce it cut through wind and rain alike. Harold froze for one brief second before climbing quickly into his Cadillac. Caleb watched the car disappear down the muddy road, then turned back toward the office. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Deliberate. He crossed the room slowly and knelt beside the desk, running his fingers along the underside of the locked drawer. There, hidden beneath old oak, he found a small brass key taped carefully out of sight. His father had not been a man prone to accidents. Caleb's pulse slowed, then deepened. Outside, lightning flashed over Black Hollow. Inside, with trembling hands and a storm gathering in his chest, Caleb unlocked the drawer and began to understand that Richard Whitmore may not have left his son a failing ranch at all. He may have left him a buried truth. The brass key turned with a quiet resistance, as though even the desk itself had spent years protecting what lay inside. Caleb opened the drawer slowly, the scent of aged paper, cedar, and leather rising from the shadows like breath from another lifetime. Inside were no overdue notices, no foreclosure warnings, no desperate confessions of financial ruin. Instead, he found order. Precision. His father's kind of order. Bound property ledgers. Survey maps. Bank statements. A weathered journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth. And beneath them all, a thick manila envelope marked only with 3 words in Richard Whitmore's unmistakable hand. If anything happens. Thunder groaned beyond the ranch house windows as Caleb sat heavily in his father's chair, the old leather creaking beneath him. For a long moment, he simply stared at the envelope, his fingers unmoving. Then, with the same cautious respect a son might use handling sacred ground, he opened it. The first page was a letter. Caleb, if you are reading this, it means I ran out of time before I could explain the danger circling Black Hollow. Trust Shadow. Do not trust Harold Pierce. Caleb's breath caught. Rain lashed harder against the glass. His eyes moved quickly over each line, his father's words striking with the weight of buried years. Richard revealed that over the last 18 months, he had uncovered falsified legal filings, manipulated mineral rights transfers, and fraudulent debt records tied directly to Harold. Quietly, patiently, Harold had been attempting to seize ownership of Black Hollow's southern ridge, land Richard had recently discovered contained significant natural gas reserves worth millions. The debt Harold kept mentioning did not exist. It had been manufactured. Richard had been gathering proof, preparing to expose him, but feared his failing heart would not allow enough time. Caleb's hands tightened around the letter. The polished concern. The urgent paperwork. The pressure to sell. It had never been legal advice. It had been theft dressed as protection. Beneath the letter sat copies of forged signatures, hidden trust amendments, and county filings that Richard had circled in red ink. There were also handwritten notes detailing secret meetings Harold had held with outside developers from Denver. Men willing to erase generations of Whitmore land for pipelines and profit. But one line stopped Caleb cold. "Shadow knows where I hid the original deed." Caleb blinked, reading it twice. Outside, a sudden sound shattered the storm's rhythm. A powerful strike against the old south barn door. Then another. Caleb rose instantly and looked through the rain-streaked office window. Across the pasture, Shadow stood near the abandoned south barn, his dark body illuminated by flashes of lightning, hooves pounding against weathered wood Richard had kept locked for years. Not random fury. Not madness. Direction. Caleb grabbed his coat and lantern, his father's journal tucked tightly beneath one arm. Mud pulled at his boots as he crossed the rain-soaked yard, wind tearing at his jacket, thunder rolling over the valley like distant cattle. Shadow did not run as Caleb approached. Instead, the Mustang stood still, breath steaming, ears forward, eyes fixed on the barn door. Waiting. Caleb placed his hand on the warped wood Richard had sealed shut since childhood. He remembered being told never to enter. He had always assumed it was storage. But now, with his father's final warning echoing through the storm and the Mustang standing guard like a sentry of forgotten truth, Caleb understood. His inheritance was never just a ranch. It was a secret worth protecting. And somewhere inside that barn, beneath years of silence, dust, and deception, Richard Whitmore had hidden the final piece Harold Pierce would do anything to keep buried. The padlock on the south barn door had not been opened in over 15 years, and it showed. Rust clung thick to the iron like dried blood from forgotten seasons, while rainwater streaked the old chain in orange veins beneath the storm-dark sky. Caleb stood beneath the sagging overhang, lantern trembling faintly in his grip as cold Montana rain soaked through his denim collar. Shadow remained close behind him, unnaturally still for a horse once branded dangerous, his dark silhouette cutting through flashes of lightning like something ancient and watchful. Caleb slid the brass key into the weathered lock Richard Whitmore had hidden beneath his desk. For one breathless second, nothing happened. Then came a hard metallic click, sharp as truth finally finding daylight. The chain fell loose. The barn door groaned inward with a sound so low and weary it seemed less like wood opening and more like memory waking. Dust, hay, and cedar rushed out to meet him, carrying the scent of old leather and summers long buried. Caleb lifted the lantern higher and stepped inside. The storm softened behind him, replaced by the sacred hush of a place untouched by time. Moonlight slipped through gaps in the warped timber walls, silvering old tack hooks, rusted horseshoes, and workbenches layered in forgotten years. This had once been Richard's private training barn, a place Caleb had only glimpsed as a boy before being told it was off limits. He remembered now the rare occasions his father disappeared here with Shadow for hours, always returning silent, thoughtful, and somehow heavier. Along the far wall stood a row of old stalls, empty except for dust and broken straw. But Shadow did not hesitate. The black Mustang moved past Caleb with quiet certainty, his hooves thudding softly across warped planks until he stopped at the final stall in the corner. There, beneath an old red saddle blanket draped over a cedar chest, Shadow lowered his head and nudged once. Then again. Caleb's pulse quickened. He pulled the blanket aside and uncovered a large wooden trunk reinforced with steel corners. Richard's initials were carved into the lid. Inside, Caleb found more than documents. He found legacy, property deeds, original mineral rights surveys, audio tapes, bank records, photographs of Harold Pierce shaking hands with corporate developers Caleb had never seen, letters from state officials, even a notarized affidavit signed by Richard himself, detailing years of fraud, coercion, and calculated attempts to manipulate ownership of Black Hollow Ranch. But one item struck deeper than the rest. A small leather journal, worn and cracked with age, labeled simply, Shadow. Caleb opened it carefully. Page after page revealed Richard's private thoughts, documenting not just legal betrayal, but the horse's role in uncovering it. Richard had noticed Harold sneaking onto the southern ridge years earlier, reviewing survey markers under false pretenses. Shadow had repeatedly tracked him, cornered him, and led Richard to hidden drilling stakes placed illegally across Whitmore land. The horse had never been unstable. He had been vigilant, loyal, protecting what his owner had not yet fully understood. Caleb's throat tightened as thunder rolled beyond the barn walls. Shadow had not become dangerous after Richard's death. He had become desperate. Every pinned ear, every violent warning, every burst of fury near Harold had been the act of a guardian trying to shield the last Whitmore from the same deception. Caleb rested one trembling hand against Shadow's powerful neck, emotion rising like floodwater beneath years of silence. "You were trying to tell me," he whispered. The mustang exhaled softly, warm breath curling through the cold barn air. Outside, rain began to ease, and somewhere beyond the storm, dawn waited. But Caleb now understood something with absolute certainty. Harold Pierce had not merely underestimated a rancher's son. He had underestimated the bond between a dying father, a loyal mustang, and the truth they had buried together beneath old wood, dust, and faith. By sunrise, the storm had passed, but Black Hollow Ranch no longer felt like the same land Caleb Whitmore had stood on the night before. Morning light spilled gold across wet pasture, cedar fences, and frost-silvered fields stretching toward the Bitterroot Mountains, yet beneath that beauty lay something sharper now. Awareness. The kind a man carries once innocence has been burned away and replaced with purpose. Caleb sat at his father's kitchen table, the trunk's contents spread before him in careful rows. Deeds, contracts, survey maps, Richard's journals. And at the center of it all, the original land deed to Black Hollow Ranch, signed decades earlier and proving beyond doubt that Harold Pierce's legal amendments were fraudulent. The southern ridge did not belong to outside developers. It belonged to the Whitmore family. Always had. Caleb traced his fingers over the faded ink, imagining his father sitting in the same chair, preparing for a battle his failing heart had not allowed him to finish. Outside the window, Shadow stood near the barn fence, still and watchful, his black mane shifting softly in the cold breeze like smoke rising from sacred ground. The mustang no longer seemed restless. He seemed certain. As though he had waited years for this morning. Caleb's eye shifted to one of the cassette tapes Richard had stored in the trunk, each labeled by date. He found the most recent and carried it to the old tape recorder in his father's office. Dust crackled as the machine sputtered to life, followed by the unmistakable voice of Richard Whitmore, older, tired, but steady. "If you are hearing this, son, Harold moved sooner than I hoped." Caleb froze. Richard's voice filled the room with quiet gravity. "I trusted him once. That was my mistake. But Shadow never did. Horses know character better than men who wear polished shoes." Caleb's throat tightened. Richard explained how Harold had manipulated county clerks, pressured neighboring ranchers, and partnered with energy corporations seeking to strip the land beneath Black Hollow for profit. But Richard had outmaneuvered him, hiding the original deed and evidence while building a legal case strong enough to destroy Harold's operation completely. "The final proof," Richard said, his voice roughening, "is in the courthouse ledger under Parcel Redirection Code 7. Harold buried it under shell agreements, but the paper trail remains." Caleb leaned forward, every word sharpening. His resolve. His father had not simply uncovered corruption. He had laid a trap. One Harold believed had died with him. But now that trap belonged to Caleb. By noon, Harold arrived again, his Cadillac slicing through ranch dust with practiced confidence. He stepped onto the porch carrying fresh contracts and that same measured smile. "I trust you reviewed the sale terms," he said smoothly. Caleb stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered and calm, Richard's journal resting in one hand. "I reviewed enough." Harold's smile flickered. "Barely. Good. Then we can finalize before taxes worsen." Caleb stepped aside just enough for Shadow to become visible in the pasture behind him, standing tall beneath morning sun, ears locked forward. Harold noticed. And for the first time, uncertainty entered his eyes. Caleb's voice remained even, but colder now. "Tell me, Harold. How much were they paying you for the ridge?" Silence settled hard between them. The lawyer's expression did not collapse, but it tightened, like ice fracturing beneath polished weight. "I do not know what you think you found," Harold said carefully. "No," Caleb replied, his father's steadiness rising fully in him at last. "But Shadow did. And my father made sure I would." In that moment, standing on weathered boards where generations of Whitmores had defended their land, Caleb stopped being a grieving son and became something stronger. He became the man Black Hollow had been waiting for. And Harold Pierce, for the first time in years, realized the ranch he thought was vulnerable had never truly been unguarded at all. Word spread through Bitterroot County faster than winter wind over open plains. By the following week, whispers of forged deeds, hidden mineral rights, and Richard Whitmore's secret evidence had traveled from feed stores to church pews, from cattle auctions to courthouse steps. Men who once tipped their hats respectfully to Harold Pierce now lowered their voices when his name surfaced. But Caleb understood something his father had known well. Truth alone was not enough. Truth had to be proven where lies had been legalized. So before dawn one bitter Monday morning, Caleb loaded Richard's journals. Financial records, tape recordings, and the original deed into his father's old Ford truck and drove 63 miles through frost-covered Montana backroads toward the Ravalli County Courthouse. Shadow followed partway along the fence line as Caleb pulled from Black Hollow, the black Mustang running beneath pale sunrise like a living blessing across frozen pasture before stopping at the southern ridge. Watching. Waiting. The courthouse stood in Hamilton like a relic of old Western certainty, built from sandstone and weathered oak, its stone columns worn by generations of ranchers, widows, and men desperate to keep what little was theirs. Caleb entered carrying more than evidence. He carried Richard Whitmore's unfinished war. County Clerk Eleanor Graves, a sharp-eyed widow in her 60s who had known Richard for decades, listened carefully as Caleb presented Parcel Code 7 and requested archived land transfer records. At first, her expression remained neutral. Professional. But as she uncovered old filings buried beneath amended corporate trusts and falsified transfer requests, her weathered hand slowed. "This cannot be right," she murmured. Hours passed beneath yellow courthouse lights as records were pulled, signatures examined, and filing dates cross-checked. By mid-afternoon, the full shape of Harold's deception began to emerge. Shell corporations. Fraudulent liens. Quietly redirected mineral leases. Multiple forged signatures, including those of neighboring ranchers long deceased. Richard had been right. Harold had not targeted only Black Hollow. He had built an empire of theft disguised as legal stewardship. Caleb stood silent as Eleanor finally removed her glasses, her voice carrying both disbelief and steel. "Your father was preparing a federal fraud case." For the first time since Richard's funeral, grief in Caleb's chest shifted. It was still heavy, but now it carried pride. His father had not died defeated. He had died fighting. By evening, official investigators from the Montana Attorney General's office were contacted. Emergency injunctions were filed against pending land sales. Harold's corporate partners began receiving legal notices before sunset. But Harold Pierce was not a man accustomed to surrender. That night, his Cadillac roared unannounced onto Black Hollow Ranch, tires spitting gravel like sparks. Caleb stepped onto the porch before Harold could knock, lantern light catching hard lines in his face. Harold's polished calm had cracked at last. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he said sharply. "Those documents can disappear. Quietly. We can still settle this." Caleb descended the porch steps slowly, each bootfall deliberate against old wood. "My father already did settle it," he said. "He just left me to finish the paperwork." Harold's eyes darkened, but before another word could form, Shadow emerged from the darkness near the barn. Silent. Towering. His black coat nearly vanished beneath moonlight except for the fierce intelligence in his gaze. Harold instinctively stepped back. The same fear. The same warning. But now Caleb understood fully. Shadow had never feared Harold. Harold had feared being seen by something he could not manipulate. "You should leave," Caleb said, his voice low as distant thunder. "Because this ranch buried your lies once. It will not do it twice." Harold turned without another word, retreating to his car as cold wind swept across the valley. Caleb stood beneath the stars, watching taillights disappear beyond the Cartonwoods. Beside him, Shadow exhaled slowly into the night. And for the first time in years, Black Hollow Ranch no longer felt hunted. It felt defended. Winter settled over Ravalli County with a quiet authority that reminded men how small they truly were. Snow gathered along fence posts, drifted across frozen pasture, and softened even the hardest edges of Black Hollow Ranch, but inside the county courthouse, there was nothing soft about what unfolded. By December, state investigators had completed a sweeping review of Harold Pierce's legal filings, corporate transactions, and property transfers stretching back nearly 12 years. What began as one rancher's suspicion had exposed a network of calculated fraud touching thousands of acres across western Montana. Ranchers who had once believed drought, taxes, or bad luck had stolen their land. Discovered forged signatures hidden beneath polished contracts. Families who had mourned inherited losses now learned those losses had been engineered. Harold Pierce had not merely betrayed Richard Whitmore. He had preyed upon an entire rural community that trusted him to protect them. The hearing drew more people than Ravalli County had seen since the livestock crash of '98. Farmers in worn coats. Ranch widows clutching faded deeds. Neighbors who had spent years believing their struggles were personal failures. Caleb Whitmore entered not as a desperate heir, but as the man carrying proof that changed everything. Richard's journals, the original Black Hollow deed, financial records, recorded testimony, and county archives formed a mountain of evidence too large for Harold's practiced charm to bury. Harold sat at the defense table in a tailored navy suit, but for the first time, his polish looked brittle. His smile no longer carried confidence. It looked rehearsed. Empty. As testimony unfolded, each carefully hidden lie surfaced beneath fluorescent courtroom light. Fraudulent shell companies. Forged probate amendments. Illegal mineral rights acquisitions. Secret land sales negotiated before rightful heirs even understood what had been stolen. Caleb listened in silence, his father's old hat resting in his lap, while Richard's recorded voice was played aloud for the court. "A ranch can survive drought," Richard had said. "But it cannot survive betrayal disguised as trust." The room fell still. Even the judge removed his glasses slowly, as though the weight of those words demanded more than legal acknowledgement. By late afternoon, the ruling came. Harold Pierce was disbarred permanently, charged with fraud, conspiracy, and multiple counts of property theft. Emergency reversals were issued restoring land ownership to affected families, including every acre of Black Hollow Ranch. Gas development contracts tied to the southern ridge were voided. Corporate partners withdrew within hours. The courtroom erupted not in celebration, but something quieter. Relief. Vindication. A kind of justice rural America rarely expects, but never forgets when it arrives. Outside, beneath a pale Montana sky, reporters gathered near courthouse steps, but Caleb offered no grand speech. He simply stood beside Eleanor Graves, accepted the restored deed, and looked toward the snowy valley beyond town. "This was never about money," he said. "It was about protecting what my father built honestly." Yet perhaps the most powerful moment came later that evening, when Caleb returned home. Shadow stood at the ridge where Richard had first discovered the illegal survey stakes years before, his dark form stark against endless white fields. Caleb rode him there slowly, through cedar windbreaks and snow-crusted grass, until they reached the southern overlook. Below stretched Black Hollow Ranch, untouched and whole beneath winter's silver hand. Caleb removed his gloves and rested one hand against Shadow's thick neck, warmth rising through the Mustang's coat like living fire. "You kept his promise," Caleb whispered. Shadow lowered his head slightly, breath curling into frozen dusk. And in that moment, Caleb understood something deeper than inheritance. Richard Whitmore had left behind land, yes. But more than that, he had left faith. Faith in truth. Faith in blood. Faith in a wild-hearted mustang no greed could tame. Across Betrayal County, men would speak for generations about the rancher who uncovered buried corruption. But at Black Hollow, where the wind still moved through cottonwoods and old fence lines sang beneath snow, they remembered something simpler. Sometimes the fiercest guardian of justice does not wear a badge or carry a title. Sometimes, he runs on four legs beneath the wide American sky. Spring came slowly to Black Hollow Ranch, as it often did in western Montana, not with fanfare but with patience. Snowmelt fed the creeks that wound silver through pastureland, cottonwoods budded along the southern ridge, and grass once buried beneath winter's silence rose green and stubborn beneath the warming sun. For Caleb Whitmore, each sunrise carried less grief and more purpose. The land his father had fought to protect was no longer under siege. It was alive again. Fences damaged by years of neglect were rebuilt by hand. Cattle herds were carefully expanded. Neighboring ranchers, many of whom had regained stolen acreage because of Richard's evidence, came willingly to help restore portions of Black Hollow's outer grazing boundaries. What Harold Pierce had nearly dismantled through greed had, in an unexpected way, united an entire community. Men who once kept to themselves now shared tools, labor, and stories over branding fires and coffee black as saddle leather. Caleb worked among them not as a symbol, but as a rancher earning every acre anew. Yet through every repaired fence line and every field reclaimed, one presence remained constant. Shadow. The Black Mustang became more than a legend whispered in Bitterroot County. He became a living symbol of Black Hollow's survival. Visitors occasionally arrived just to catch a glimpse of the horse once labeled too dangerous, only to find an animal whose power was matched by remarkable calm. Shadow remained wild in spirit, never truly broken, but under Caleb's steady hand, he revealed the same truth Richard had always known. Strength did not equal savagery. Some spirits simply refused false masters. Caleb often rode Shadow at dawn across the southern ridge, where sunlight spilled over thousands of acres his family had nearly lost. There, among dew-soaked grass and open sky stretching wider than worry, Caleb would read from Richard's journals. Not legal records anymore, but personal entries. Notes about weather. Lessons on horseflesh. Reflections on honor. His father's words became less like ghosts and more like guidance. Land, Richard once wrote, is not what a man owns. It is what he protects long enough to pass on honestly. Those words rooted deeply. By summer, Caleb made a decision that surprised many. Rather than lease the southern ridge for its gas wealth, he placed portions of Black Hollow into a permanent agricultural conservation trust, ensuring the land could never again be exploited through corporate schemes. It was not the fastest path to wealth. But it was the Whitmore way. Honest. Enduring. Eleanor Graves herself called it one of the most significant private land preservation acts the county had seen in decades. Black Hollow would remain. A working ranch. A legacy. Not a transaction. The Old South Barn, once a forgotten vault of buried truth, was carefully restored into a heritage stable honoring Richard's life and the role Shadow played in preserving it. Caleb left one section untouched, however. Richard's original trunk remained there, beneath the red saddle blanket, exactly where it had been hidden. Not as a secret anymore, but as a reminder. Some truths deserve remembering in the places they were defended. On warm evenings, as amber sunlight settled across Montana hills and cattle bells echoed softly through the valley, Caleb often stood by the pasture fence watching Shadow run free beneath endless sky. Powerful. Unbroken. No longer feared. Sometimes local children from neighboring ranches would point and ask if the stories were true. Did that horse really save Black Hollow Ranch? Caleb would simply smile, tipping his father's old hat lower against the sun. No, he would say quietly. He protected it until we were ready to save it ourselves. And beneath the wide western horizon, where wind moved through cedar and memory lived in hoofpits, Black Hollow no longer stood as a place nearly stolen. It stood as proof that loyalty, truth, and one untamed mustang could rebuild far more than land. They could rebuild faith. Years later, when autumn painted the Bitterroot Valley in gold, copper, and crimson, Black Hollow Ranch stood stronger than it had in generations. Its fences stretched true across thousands of protected acres. Its cattle moved healthy through open pasture. Its barns, once weathered by silence and secrets, now carried the steady rhythm of honest work. Caleb Whitmore had not become the wealthiest rancher in Montana, nor had he sought to be. Instead, he became something rarer. He became a steward worthy of what had been entrusted to him. Beneath his leadership, Black Hollow evolved into more than a family ranch. It became a symbol throughout the region of ethical land preservation, resilient agriculture, and the enduring values Richard Whitmore had fought to protect. Young ranchers came to learn sustainable grazing. Families visited the heritage stable to hear the story of the mustang, once condemned by fear but proven by loyalty. Local schools brought children each spring to walk the southern ridge, where Caleb taught not merely about land ownership, but about responsibility. The land remembers how you treat it, he often told them, his father's weathered hat still resting low on his brow. So do horses. Shadow, now older but no less magnificent, remained the soul of Black Hollow. Time silvered the edges of his dark mane, but it never dimmed the intelligence in his eyes or the quiet strength in his stride. Caleb never caged him beyond necessity. Shadow still roamed large sections of protected pasture freely, as though Black Hollow itself understood that some guardian should never be confined. Visitors would often stand breathless at pasture fences, watching the legendary Mustang crest the southern ridge at sunset, his silhouette framed against Montana sky like something carved from old Western myth. Yet to Caleb, Shadow was never myth. He was family. On certain evenings, when work was done and dusk settled soft over the valley, Caleb would ride Shadow to the Cartonwood Grove where Richard Whitmore was buried. There, father, son, and horse shared a silence deeper than words. Caleb often read aloud from Richard's journals, though by then he knew most passages by heart. Not because he feared forgetting, but because remembrance itself had become sacred. One October evening, nearly a decade after Harold Pierce's downfall, Caleb dismounted beneath the old cottonwoods and rested his hand along Shadow's graying neck. The wind moved softly through fallen leaves, carrying with it the scent of cedar, dry grass, and distant snow. Black Hollow stretched below them, bathed in amber light so beautiful it almost seemed heaven had leaned down to touch the land Richard had saved. Caleb looked across the ranch, then toward his father's weathered headstone. "You were right," he said quietly. "Some spirits are not meant to be broken." Shadow lowered his head slightly, as though honoring both men in his own untamed way. In that moment, Caleb understood the full measure of his inheritance. It had never been about deeds, mineral rights, or financial worth. It was about truth protected through courage. About legacy preserved through sacrifice. About recognizing that sometimes the wildest hearts are the ones most faithful to what matters. As the sun disappeared beyond Montana's rolling horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch that had survived greed, grief, and betrayal, Caleb mounted once more and rode home beneath a sky wide enough to hold generations. And though Black Hollow's story would be told for decades in ranch towns, barns, and family kitchens across the American West, its deepest lesson remained beautifully simple. Sometimes the ones the world fears most are not dangerous at all. Sometimes, they are merely guarding the miracle others are too blind to see.